Although it will still be used for testing and development, there'll be no more motor racing at Goodwood, one of Britain's 3 major circuits. Reason for the closure? The track is unsafe for the new Grand Prix formula and the big sports cars, so much faster than the machines of 18 years ago.
Difficult to put across to younger people what it was like then, but there was this gigantic hunger for racing, which had been denied to people for so long, which Goodwood was one of the places that was helping to satisfy.
Goodwood was a very, very important venue for everyone. In those days it was a social event as well as anything else, and we had names like Hawthorne and Moss and Fangio and my father and all kinds of people who have since gone down as legends in motorsport.
It had a kind of festive atmosphere all the time. It was a sort of country life look to it, and people were quite chic, and if you went to Goodwood it was a little bit like, not quite Ascot maybe, but it was that kind of ambience.
For the past 2 years, Goodwood has once again echoed to the sound of straining engines. But for these men and machines, the race is against the clock. Everything must soon be ready for the greatest gathering of historic cars and drivers ever seen at the West Sussex Circuit. 32 years after the 9th Duke of Richmond staged his last motor race on the country estate, a long-standing dream will finally be fulfilled by his grandson.
Ever since the track closed in 1966, it's been a very important thing for me personally to get it opened again. It was a great thing in my childhood to come down here and be with my grandfather and see all the great drivers and cars roaring around here. It was a fantastic experience.
The circuit played a key role in Britain's post-war rise in world motor racing. It was the personal passion of Freddie March, the Duke, himself a successful driver in the 1930s. Now the aim is to recreate Goodwood's golden era to the finest detail. But Lord March knows it won't be easy.
Well, we have given ourselves quite a task. Yeah, there's a lot to do in the time, but I'm sure we'll do it, and you know, hopefully it'll be a big success on the day.
10,000 miles away in Melbourne, news of the reopening has reached the Australian landowner who inspired the original circuit.
Yeah, by golly, Max, they look pretty hungry.
We're feeding the cattle every... Life on the farm is a far cry from the years Tony Gaze spent in England. During World War II, he flew hundreds of sorties from Goodwood as a Spitfire pilot, and he has fond memories of the Duke, whose social status counted for little in the RAF.
One station he was in, it was a bit of a thing that, you know, here's a Duke who's a flight lieutenant and he has to call the wing commander, sir, and the wing commander from Tangmere came over and was regaling the mess with stories about how there was this wall near Tangmere around the Goodwood estate. He said, and if you go there in the evening, he said, there's pheasants coming and they walk along that wall and you can knock them off and have them the next day to eat. And the Duke apparently stood on it as high as he could get and said, sir, they are my pheasants and it's my bloody wall.
It was his road, too, around the airfield, which provided Tony and a friend with some fun between flights.
We both had MGs and we used to race around this perimeter track. And we got other people to join in occasionally. When I met the Duke, they told me he was looking for a track, and I thought, well, gosh, he's got one.
The Duke of Richmond, the present Earl's granddad, was a great racing man, and he invited us down there with some 500cc cars. And he drove one of them, actually, around the aerodrome, and they decided to turn it into a circuit.
It wouldn't have cost a lot, you see, because the track was there. I mean, it was a perfectly good track that hadn't been built all that long, and he owned the whole shooting match. He was very pleased with his lavatories. He said, we've got the only decent loos on any motor racing circuit.
On September the 18th, 1948, Goodwood held its first meeting. With the pre-war circuit at Brooklands in disrepair, motor racing needed a new home. Even so, demand exceeded all expectations. 15,000 people turned up. There were no grandstands, pits or paddock, but the races were a huge success. The star of the day was Reg Parnell, taking victory in his Maserati in the main race, the Goodwood Trophy. But the supporters, who made use of every conceivable vantage point, had unwittingly already seen the most significant result of the afternoon, an impressive win for a teenager in his first ever race on a circuit.
At that time, I had never passed other cars on the road. I mean, I'd been doing hill climbs, so you don't see them. But once you can get onto a circuit, you can then start using race tactics, which of course I had no idea about. I didn't know what slipstreaming was. I didn't know what out-cycling another driver. I mean, these are things which came later. And so to actually be out there with other blokes and passing them and seeing what they were doing, and it was a tremendous occasion. It's something that is difficult to describe even now, because I was like a virgin at it, you know. Let's face it, I've never done it before.
Over the next 18 years, many more glittering careers would begin at Goodwood, including that of Derek Bell, whose family farm is just a few miles from the track.
The influence was great on me. I mean, I'd be out there in the field, you know, the old man had me out there hoeing sugar beet or something delightful. And I could hear, as I say, the cars going around. And then, of course, as I developed, he'd let me drive tractors and things at the age of 9 and 10. And I'd be going up and down the field actually sort of fantasizing about one day actually racing at Goodwood, and maybe one day winning a race, let alone know that I'd actually have my first race there and then go on to race all around the world.
Derek shares the all-time record for victories at Le Mans, 5 times the winner of the most prestigious event in sports car racing. But even now, he's stirred by thoughts of his less illustrious debut.
And I remember it was a handicap race, and I sat in the middle of the grid because they didn't know if I was any good or not. And on the back row, a sort of scratch car, was Hugh Dibley, who was an airline pilot, and he was in Sterling Mossett Automobile Racing Team's Brabham, which was the latest high-tech, beautiful sports car. And I thought, well, whatever am I doing in a race with that? I'm in this little sort of homemade kit car. Around me were lots of homemade kit cars like mine, Lotus 7. And as I went around, teeming rain, I just kept seeing cars spinning off. And I came around on the first lap, and I thought, well, where is everybody? And I kept going and kept going, and I came around the next lap, and they put down P1, and I'm going, I don't believe this. And I thought, well, where's Hugh Dibley? This Brabham's got to come flying up in a minute and zap by me. And I started to laugh, and I went over the line and won the race. That was my first win, and of course I won this wonderful thing called an alarm clock, which always helps you a lot when you're a young driver towards buying your first set of tyres.
From its opening, Goodwood had quickly established itself at the centre of a growing industry. By the early 1950s, the circuit was attracting crowds of up to 50,000. British motor racing was feeling the benefit of the ingenuity and invention fostered by the war.
In little bomb site garages, in little railway arches, the British club racer was developing cars of his own, revolutionary cars. Men like John Cooper, who built the first rear-engine Formula 3 cars in the late 40s, Colin Chapman, who built these clever Lotuses out of Austin 7 and Ford 10 bits. And it all started building little cars for little club events here at Goodwood.
The biggest race was Easter Monday. That was the real thing. And that was, in those days, was one of the first races of the year where we tested our new cars and brought them out, you know, after struggling to make them in the winter. We won the World Championship 59 and 60, and a lot of our testing of those cars was done at Goodwood.
Many important breakthroughs were made on non-race days. Top drivers like Roy Salvadori tested their machines to the limit, and young hopefuls were set on the road to stardom.
I had this telephone call from Robin Mackay. Robin Mackay was the track manager at Goodwood at the time. And he said to me, Ken, you're always looking for young up-and-coming drivers, and there's just this young Scot has been driving around here in a Cooper Monaco, and he looks very good indeed.
I was given a chance to drive a Cooper Formula 3 car, because this was going to be the first year of Formula 3 in 1964, a tryout for Ken Tyrrell, which I did, in fact, with Bruce McLaren as the #1 Cooper Formula 1 driver at that time.
Jackie got in after a big lecture on You know, he's got all day, it's a nice day, just take your time. First time in a single-seater. And within a few laps, he was going quicker than Bruce had been going.
And Bruce set a target time, and Jackie exceeded it with ease. Bruce jumped back in, and Jackie beat him again, and Ken Tyrrell realised that, you know, there was a bit of a needle match on here, and Bruce was getting somewhat embarrassed, quite frankly.
And while all this was happening, obviously now we were getting a bit impressed, and maybe we ought to sign this young guy up. John Cooper, who'd been watching down at the first corner, came rushing up to me and said, "Get that boy signed up, quick."
The first time I saw him drive that car, I knew he had it. I could see it, you know, I knew straight away. And so did Tyrrell, we both knew.
I don't know if I knew what pressure was then. I knew I had to drive well, but I was so innocent and so naive that I just got in and drove by the seat of my pants, and apparently, fortunately, went fast enough to get the job done.
I think Stuart was wise to what was going on because he already had an agent and negotiated a good deal and has proven to be a very successful businessman here on.
The trouble with Jackie, he was always so very cheeky and so cocky, you know, always walking around on his bloody toes, and knew the answers to most things, you know, which was annoying sometimes.
It was Jackie Stewart, really, that made Tyrrell, if you think about it. I mean, it was Tyrrell and Jackie Stewart that won the World Championship 3 times, and wonderful, wonderful setup.
Although Stewart was his most notable protege, by that time Tyrrell could already claim credit for steering another outstanding driver in the right direction. In 1960, the world motorcycling champion John Surtees fancied trying cars, and Ken was happy to make it happen.
He'd said to me, he said, "John, if you go in motor racing, you need a license. If you need a license, I've fixed it. You can drive my Formula Junior at the Goodwood, I think, March meeting." And I had a great dice with Jim Clark in the Works Lotus. Made a mistake, forgot I had 4 wheels, and got myself all on the grass for a moment, and Jim just pipped me.
When John got in the car straight away, it was just natural. And it was the same with Jackie. You know, they just, it's unfair, really, they can't help it.
John went on from success to success, the only winner of world titles on 2 and 4 wheels. Nowadays, he can be found every summer at Goodwood, still displaying his passion for motorsport on the Festival of Speed hill climb. And someone else who has a good reason to drop in each year is the now voice of motor racing, Murray Walker.
Goodwood is a very emotional word for me because I wanted to get into broadcasting, and in 1948 the BBC asked me if I would like to have an audition to be a commentator, and I said, yeah, can a duck swim? I certainly would. And they said, right, well, you'll go down to Goodwood and do some commentary on cars. Now, at that time, I was very, very much a motorcycle man. That was where my expertise and knowledge and enthusiasm were. But I went down to Goodwood and I commentated, sure enough, on 3 races, 3 sprint races. And as a result of that, the next week, the BBC got in touch with me and said, come down and see us, which I did. And they said the audition went well, and would you like the 2nd position for the British Grand Prix at Silverstone? And that was how it all began.
Over the years, the crowd was thrilled by all the greats. Legends like Juan Manuel Fangio, 5 times a world champion, Mike Hawthorne in Tony van der Velde's unmistakable thin-wall special Ferrari, Graham Hill, hugely popular throughout the land, and the wonderfully talented Jim Clark, so tragically killed in his prime at Hockenheim. The World War II airfield, converted by enthusiastic amateurs, had gained international renown.
Some of the races in that first 1948 event were only 3-lappers, but after the fast that they'd had throughout the war, the enthusiasts thought it was absolutely marvellous. And by the early 1950s, Goodwood had become an absolutely central part of the British motor racing scene.
It was a good circuit, a very nice atmosphere, and because let's face it, it was pretty well nearly Hobson's choice. There weren't that many places you could go to race anyway. It filled a tremendous void.
Of all the heroes, Moss received the most attention and adulation. But no one knew that the circuit which gave him his first win would one day almost end his life. Goodwood's status as Britain's foremost racetrack would not survive through the 50s. Facing new competition, it settled for staging 3 international events a year. The most popular was Easter Monday, the first meeting of the European season. The circuit was ideal for shaking down new machinery, a reputation maintained even after its closure for racing.
I think at that time it was considered to be one of the best testing tracks because it covered every aspect of the car. And if you had a car that was particularly good around Goodwood, then you almost guaranteed that you had a very competitive car for the season in a conglomerate of different types of circuits.
But it was the atmosphere which really made Goodwood special. Motor racing had begun as a sport for gentlemen, and the Duke of Richmond aimed to preserve those ideals.
Pre-war in Brooklands, they used to say, we have the right crowd and no crowding. In other words, it was a pretty upmarket sport. And although Goodwood wasn't quite like that, it was getting on that way, and there was a great atmosphere.
Because it was set, you know, with the downs behind it, it had a lovely setting. It didn't seem to be like in the middle of nowhere, as a lot of tracks are. Everybody just came with their picnics and sat around and really enjoyed it. It was it was a good day out for the family.
Well, we had a great little caravan on the chicane always, with no protection around it or anything like that, you know, absolutely amazing. And we used to always sit there eating kind of hard-boiled eggs and sausages. Everyone came racing at Goodwood Easter Monday, whether they were keen on racing or not.
The drivers enjoyed it as much as spectators. The social get-togethers held by the Duke were legendary.
There was drivers who partied and drivers who didn't party. I think, to a large extent, the serious ones who were consistently fast didn't party that much at the wrong times. They did their partying away from race meetings. Today, of course, if Schumacher went along to a little function the night before a race, everybody would be obviously looking for how this affected his performance the next day.
In those days, if you were an ordinary spectator, you could get to the drivers and you could talk to them. You could go and say, well, Jack, how's it going? Sterling, how's it going? Tony, any problems with the car? In a way that's just not possible these days.
There were no such things as physiotherapists and dreadful PR people and things like that. I mean, there was no entourage whatsoever. I mean, it was just normal people.
Motor racing was fun until money came in. And I mean, money was paid there. I mean, a big deal. You'd pay, I can't remember the figures, but probably £2, £10 or £5 to enter, and if you won, you'd probably win £15 or 20. And then you go off to the company for whose oil you were using and say, listen, I won this race, they say, well, here's a £5 for you.
There's no comparison at all. The only thing that's similar is you operate the pedals with your feet and you steer with your hands. And you go around a racetrack, and other than that, it's very different.
Now, hundreds of millions of pounds are spent every year in the quest for success. Every turn of a wheel falls under the most intense scrutiny. There's no longer any room for mistakes.
I can remember Duncan Hamilton, a great character. I remember he had one of the new Maseratis, and he said to the mechanic, look, you work on the car, get it sorted out, and I'll drive the transporter down on the Monday, and you can drive my car, you see. So Duncan, being old Duncan, came up, saw the transporter on the forecourt, got in it, drove it down to Goodwood. All the press were waiting, because this was the new Maserati, to see it. He opened the doors, and of course they hadn't loaded it, had they? It was still on the bloody ram.
Our first year in Formula One with the Matra, it's true that the Matra cars were on free loan to us. Our first year sponsorship was £80,000. £80,000 wouldn't take you very far today. I mean, just about get you a Formula Ford drive, I should think.
5, 7 years ago, when we came into Formula One, a normal budget was somewhere in the region of about £10 million. If you were quite lucky and you had that, then you could do a particularly good job. Nowadays, I don't believe you're able to get on the grid. You couldn't even have a car.
Things move on, don't they? I mean, we can't keep running around in front in the engine Maserati Formula One cars, can we? Things had to change. Things have to improve all the time, and tyres and aerodynamics became of vital importance, and that changed motor racing considerably, but it didn't change the enjoyment.
I think motor racing in those days was wonderful in many aspects of it, but today's motor racing is better. The facilities are better, the size of the sport is bigger, the spread is global, the number of public that are interested in it much greater. So, I mean, there was a time, and that time's passed.
There's one other change which most agree has made motor racing better: increased safety. The renovated Goodwood must meet all the modern-day standards. Every car racing was built before 1966, so the track layout can stay. But the boundaries have been pushed back with gravel traps to rescue the unwary. The policy would have earned the 9th Duke of Richmond's approval. From the earliest meetings, he was worried for the welfare of drivers and spectators. Within 3 years of the opening, the most powerful cars were lapping at an average of almost 100 miles an hour, and he knew something must be done.
The speeds past the pit area were increasing year by year for obvious reasons as development took place. And the chicane was introduced, and they built a fairly solid brick wall which commanded the respect of all the drivers. Although they had some wattle fencing on the outside, and that used to get demolished regularly. But eventually they put a concave curb on the outside. And of course the grandstand viewing area there was good entertainment.
If you'd asked anybody then, was Goodwood a safe circuit, were there the right safety provisions, they would have said yes, certainly. There were earth banks, there was an ambulance, there was a medical centre and a doctor always here. So for the time, the correct safety precautions were made, but the time was different.
One of the most frightening things I think that I've ever witnessed was a guy called Peter Proctor driving a Ford Anglia came off at St Mary's and rolled onto the inside where we were spectating, and probably no more than 10 feet away the car burst into flames, and luckily he was able to crawl out. But I mean, there was nothing to protect the crowd from that car. One more roll and it would have been on top of us.
Eventually I became a marshal at Goodwood for Bognor Motor Club, and we used to go up there, and of course the closest I could get to the car was to actually go and have a flag, and so I'd stand there with a yellow flag or a blue flag or whatever it was. I remember particularly being at Madgwick, which is first corner, and the cars would come around there, and literally we were standing probably 20 foot back from the edge of the grass as the Surtees and so on came drifting through the corner. You never thought twice about it.
The dangers never discouraged the drivers. It was foot to the floor even through the most difficult corners. And for when things went wrong, some had developed very personal survival techniques.
Maston Gregory obviously felt that if he was going to have an accident, it might be a good idea if he wasn't in the car at the time that the car hit the wall or the bank or whatever it was. Because he developed this technique of getting half out the car just before it hit the wall, so that he was thrown clear and only the car got damaged and not him.
One of Goodwood's most memorable days combined the best and worst of motor racing before its modernisation. By 1959, Britain's reputation in the sport had never been stronger. In September, the mighty Ferrari and Porsche teams came to take on Aston Martin in the Tourist Trophy. The result would decide the World Sports Car Championship. Only an outright win would be enough for Aston Martin. But soon disaster struck.
I think we were about a lap in the lead, and I called in to hand over to Sterling, and just getting out of the car, felt something very cold on my back. And I thought, that's pleasant. And suddenly the whole car was alight, me as well.
It was a pretty amazing sight, which as enthusiasts, as drivers, and as the public, they weren't used to it. I mean, that was the first big fire I think that probably many of us had ever seen.
I dived over the front of the car, kicked a mechanic on the head who was taking one of the wheels off. That's the first he knew of the fire, so I'd moved pretty quickly. And fortunately, the St. John's ambulance guy there threw his overcoat over me, which helped put the flames out, but my arm and hand was still alight. So he took his cap off and wrapped that round my arm and hand and put that out.
It was a shock because I was standing there waiting to have a go myself, and that is a shock. Suddenly a car goes up in flames. It was something that I'd never seen, and I mean, forget all your fireproof overalls and all that sort of thing. Those didn't exist.
3 pits were completely destroyed, but the race was still on. After frantic discussion, Moss was switched to the second car as his friend Salvadori was rushed to hospital. The fire and delay had dropped the Aston Martins to third, but Moss kept his composure to produce a stunning comeback. For lap after lap, he reeled in the Ferraris, eventually retaking the lead. The Italian's dominance was about to be broken. Moss crossed the line more than a lap ahead. The British were world champions for the first time. Moss was concerned for Salvadori, but he had no need to worry.
They patched me up, and I went back to the Aston Martin pit and took an interest, and from memory, we had a respectable party after all that, all in a day's work.
There wouldn't always be lucky escapes. Easter Monday, 1962. Everyone anticipated a day to remember. As ever, the Richmond Trophy attracted a quality field and spirits were high after the winter break. Sterling Moss's hopes would be quickly dashed by mechanical problems, but typically he was determined to put on a show.
We weren't dicing for the lead. Both of us had had a pit stop, and this had allowed Graham Hill to get away and have an untroubled run, but both of us were sort of still racing each other. Different parts of the circuit were racing for one thing only, and that was the lap record. I do obviously recall coming round and seeing that there'd been a rather big shunt.
I was marshalling at Madgwick, and I remember the marshals obviously could talk with these old wind-up telephones, they could talk from one post to the other, and we suddenly heard that there'd been this major accident with Sterling involved.
We were all watching his progress through the field, and suddenly he came into view to St Mary's, but he never took the right-hand bit of the corner complex. He just went straight on.
In the grandstand, all I remember sitting there seeing was a cloud of dust as this car inexplicably shot along the grass, a terrible thud, and then everybody in the grandstand stood up.
It seems like a lifetime, but it's probably only 10 or 20 minutes, and you see all the people gathering around. It's obviously, it becomes a problem, and then, a whisper goes round that things aren't looking too good, and so on. So, and it, by the end of the race, of course, everybody was pretty hushed, and the whole tone of the meeting was gone.
We only knew that there'd been a serious accident and that Sterling had been taken to hospital. We had no idea how serious it was, and it was some days before we discovered that maybe he would never drive again.
I still don't know what happened in the accident. I know what actually finished up. In other words, I went in the bank and they had to cut me out of the car, and I was unconscious for a month, and all that I know, but I don't know why it happened. The last thing I remember is going to a party the night before, met a very cute girl, and that's it. I don't remember any more from there. And I just have no idea what happened. My first memory after the crash was about a month later, and of course I'd been unconscious and you don't know it. I mean, I opened my eyes and I looked around, and there were loads of flowers, and I seem to remember there were a lot of lilac flowers, and I remember sort of saying, gosh, they must have expected me to die, not realising how close I'd been.
A year later, Moss went back to Goodwood, hoping to prove to himself that he could recapture the happy times, but the magic had gone.
My times were competitive. My time wasn't bad at all, but the concentration that it requires to race I hadn't got, and therefore to do a lap was tremendously difficult for me. And I found that the strain was tremendous. I thought, well, I just can't carry on, because in a race, and they were 3-hour minimum usually, this is going to be too much for me. So I thought, well, I have to retire. Once I decided to retire, then I had to accept it, and it wasn't too difficult.
I suppose you'd have to compare it with Senna's accident, really. With Fangio retired, Sterling was the best driver in the world, no question about that. And such a great loss to motor racing.
He was a magical, charismatic figure in his day. Well, he's still a charismatic bloke now, but I mean, in his day, he was Damon Hill, Nigel Mansell, all rolled into one. And Sterling got headline news about the crash and his developments in a way that no other racing driver in Britain had ever done before.
The accident surely contributed further to the Duke of Richmond's unease over safety. Although the track continued to operate for another 4 years, increasing speeds meant the case for it to close was building.
I'm sure he was concerned, because obviously I felt he was a friend, you know, but I hope it didn't affect in any way the closure of the circuit, because I love the circuit, and but I suppose it must have had some effect, obviously, because pressure's coming to bear on him.
They'd had to change a lot of things on the track, yeah. It would cost a fortune, but at that time I don't think that was the real reason. I think there was a lot of local pressure because of the noise, to be honest with you. And I have to say, I think the present Duke of Richmond and Gordon, I don't think he was that keen on cars. And I think he was into horses, which, you know, is fair enough. We've got the most beautiful horse track up there as well. I mean, you know, which way should we go, horses or cars? Let's go cars this time, this generation. And I don't begrudge him that.
Well, my father certainly, you know, he's reasonably keen, and he's certainly not in any way against it. As a child, I don't, you know, I don't remember the accidents that badly, but my sister's godfather, for instance, was killed in an accident. He hit reverse instead of fourth, and the car just disintegrated. And he was a very close friend of the family. And that obviously, you know, affected him very badly. And one of the major reasons my grandfather closed the circuit was because he couldn't take any more of the idea of there being any major accidents and him being so closely involved with it.
In July 1966, Goodwood said goodbye to racing. 18 enjoyable years were over, with only the occasional test session to break the silence. But now, more than 3 decades later, a new beginning beckons. Enjoy the sight of a master at work. This was the view for Stirling Moss in 1960 as he took his Cooper around the Goodwood circuit. Those racing at the Revival meeting will find very little has changed. While most racetracks have altered beyond recognition in the past 2 decades, Goodwood's fast curves have remained untouched. A lap now will be just as the drivers remembered.
The circuit isn't that wide, but in a Cooper, which was a little small car, it seemed very adequate, I'll tell you that. The road was really quite wide. Of course, originally there was no chicane. Then they brought in the chicane, which we quite understood why, because it was a bit dangerous, I think, in the pits then. But it was just generally a nice, and to me, obviously, remember, this is the first place I've ever raced on a road as against a hill climb, so it was very challenging.
Everyone used to say you could take the first corner flat in a 500, you see, and Sterling did, of course, without much trouble. And I did it once myself, and accomplished it, and did the fastest lap I'd ever did down Goodwood because of it. But I never ever got round to doing it again.
Goodwood's a flowing circuit. There is a few problems like forward water where you sort of go over the hill and suddenly you lose sight of the edge of the road and things like this. But generally, it's a sort of circuit that I liked because of the nature of the corners.
It had such a combination of corners that I found it very, very exciting. And St Mary's, you've got this incredible corner, one where Sterling went off and the right-hander there, then the drop down into the second part of St Mary's. and then the right-hander into Lavant corner. I mean, terribly demanding corners, and one corner led into another.
In many ways difficult to read because it was an old airfield, so it was fairly flat. It was difficult to get to know it, not having driven there before, because so low and so flat, there were no features to be able to identify it with. There were very few features, in fact, from a driver's point of view, to Goodwood.
Down the straight and you come into the end, I can remember so well, because I think it's still there, sort of building, an old farm building, or no, I suppose an Air Force building, and you come down into that corner, and that corner was quite difficult.
In Woodcote, you didn't break in a nice straight line down by the edge of the grass. You braked sort of across down through the middle of the corner, then turned right and went through it, and then you, of course, tried not to hit the chicane. I mean, it's a very, very difficult circuit.
The reopening for historic racing is the culmination of 6 years' hard work. For Lord March, there's been meeting after meeting, call after call, speech after speech. But he's been carried along by an overwhelming affection for almost anything with a motor. He has cherished vivid childhood memories of his grandfather's circuit, the first of them a little unusual.
Graham Hill telling me to bugger off, I think, probably. I was trying to get his autograph. I think I was getting in the way or getting under his feet or something. I was about 8 then. And it was a perfectly affectionate kind of, get out of my way. I spent a lot of time with my grandfather when I was little. He took me to the races, walked around the paddock with him. He used to send me, Veteran Vintage magazine at school and things. So, and all the presents he gave me were always car-related. So, I guess that was, that's how it goes, isn't it, really?
But reliving Goodwood's greatest years would not be easy. As Lord March was about to discover, while memories are free, recreating them is much more expensive. Since 1966, the circuit's been used only for test sessions and driving lessons. What wasn't needed was left to rot. But before even that work could begin, nearby residents needed to be satisfied they wouldn't need earplugs every weekend.
There is no doubt that when the historic events themselves take place, the historic racing weekends, there will be considerable amount of noise and disturbance, and nobody shies away from that fact. We literally had thousands of pro forma objections. We had objections from all over the world, but equally we had support from all over the world.
The eventual solution was simple but costly. Large earth banks have been constructed around the entire circuit to trap the noise. A sophisticated sound monitoring systems being linked directly to the council offices. And in return for unrestricted noise on race days, Goodwood will stay silent for 100 days a year.
We've had to do a huge amount of work, and we've also had to completely change our calendar and the way we operate throughout the year. So in terms of cost to us, every way round, capital cost and income, that's been fairly tough. But it's something I was very keen to see happen. A racetrack without a race meeting is, it's a dead place.
It took more than 2 years to complete the planning process. But with the objections addressed, everyone could start looking forward. Not least the enthusiasts from nearby Bognor Motor Club with its history of marshalling the races.
The big meetings were tremendous. You always have a fantastic international atmosphere, but the club meetings are always something special, and you get lots of different people from all over the country and lots of local people out racing. And great fun meetings, and something you could, as a kid, you could aspire to yourself. You think, I could do this one day myself.
Right in the early days of Goodwood, I was a steward on the chicane. And walking down on the wrong side of the barrier was a fellow in a camel coat, dirty old camel coat, you see. And I went across, I said, now look, come on, over the barrier. And he said, I just want to go down to the chicane. I said, I don't care where you want to go, over the barrier. When I got back to the boys at the chicane, they said, do you know who you've been talking to, Will? I said, no. He said, that was the Duke of Richmond.
I suppose I'm the villain of the piece here because I was the one who used to creep under the fence to get in. I don't think I ever paid to get in, actually, so I suppose I owe the Earl of March a shilling or two now.
Well, things are going to change, have they, Alan, for you?
I come over now.
Never paid for anything.
Lord March could probably make use of that money now. Goodwood won't reveal how much has been spent to bring the track back to life, but the cost certainly runs to several £1 million.
The landscaping's been huge. We've planted something like 26,000 trees, moved something like 1 million tonnes of earth, not to mention all the turfing and the shrubs and the planting in the banks. We've been spraying all the banks with wildflowers. You know, it's been a huge job, and that's where most of the money's been spent. The driving energy, the driving force has been that we want this thing to happen. We want this site restored to how it was. It hasn't been to make money. We had permission for a large business park here. There's a great deal of minerals under this site. There are lots of things we could have done with it if we hadn't wanted to go this route, but we believe this is the right way for such an historic place.
Everything is almost complete. The major work is over, but the test will come with the return of those who remember the track in its prime. With a few weeks to go, the man who inspired the original circuit will be one of the first to visit. Tony Gaze has flown from Australia to see whether the recreation can match up to his memories.
We had a sort of 35th anniversary get-together of the old Formula One drivers in Italy last year, and it was mentioned that it was possible that it would be ready for this year, and that's the first thing I heard of it. I was extremely excited, and you know, I'd never really thought, you know, once I'd heard that the circuit had closed down except for testing, I imagined that that was it. It would never be used for racing again. It's going to be as near possible exactly the way it was the day it closed down, and that's the way it was when it was first made, because it was never changed.
Tony's initial impressions are favourable. Arriving at the circuit is just as he remembered, but on emerging from the tunnel under the track, a surprise.
I wouldn't recognise it from here, though, with all these hangars. Gosh, it's more like, it really is like an aerodrome, which it never was when we flew from it during the war, because you didn't want it to look like an aerodrome. You wanted the enemy to think it was still a farm.
Waiting in the paddock, a D-type Jaguar, similar to the sports cars Tony himself used to race. There's only one way to get a true impression of the work that's been done. More than 40 years after his last drive at Goodwood, Tony is about to enjoy the circuit all over again.
Okay, Tony, let's go for it. Let's go. Let's see what it's like. Oh, it's better than what I expected. I mean, there are a couple of things. I think the chicane's in the wrong place, but other than that, I mean, the circuit's great. Much better than it was in a way when we drove on it. All these earth banks, I mean, are going to give the public a better look than they've ever had. No, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and you know, it's like going back 40 years.
Equally impressed is Robin Mackay. On his return to the track that he used to manage, he finds it hard to believe what he sees.
It's just the enormous improvement that Lord March has made to it. I mean, I'd heard that he'd, you know, was spending a lot on improvements, but I had no idea of the magnitude of it, no idea at all. And it all looks very impressive.
Slowly but surely, the face of the decaying circuit has been transformed. A ramshackle pit lane replaced by a smart new complex, and the familiar icons will be there. The original clock is working again and back in place, counting the hours until the racers return.
I like the idea of keeping the whole atmosphere as it was, with people in dress of the 50s, and the cars that they arrive in, the trailers that they're going to bring the cars on are supposed to be period trailers and everything. So
the crush huts and all the ovals are all going to be
everything
of the
as
era.
near as possible.
An interesting thing, I hope we do see, I mean, obviously we're going to see some demonstration type races with some of the old stars, but with a few exceptions like Sterling Moss, who still races, you know, foot to the floor and sort of give it some hammer. Many of them are getting quite elderly now and haven't raced for a number of years. And I hope we do see proper racing and not just demonstrations completely. I'm sure we won't. I'm sure we will see some real racing.
Most of the owners that own these cars now will say to their drivers, race them, as they do at Silverstone.
Yes, absolutely.
They say race them, don't worry about the cars, just race them, and that's how they do now today still.
Oh, they'll race. Racing drivers always race. Somebody in there will have a race.
When they put us into old cars, historic cars, they all say, just go around and give us a demonstration. It's like me at Goodwood on the hill climb. They know darn well that stick you behind a steering wheel, you're going to try and go as fast as you can.
They're not supposed to race, are they? I think... Could you imagine someone getting out on that circuit and not going to race? No, it'd be a very interesting meeting.
Moss will drive with many others, Surtees, Brabham, Brooks, Gurney and Salvadori among them. Sadly, of course, not everyone can return. But Graham Hill will be represented by son Damon, who's looking forward to getting to grips with a BRM and a Ferrari in the same way that his father did.
The cars were beautifully made, and they're examples of craftsmanship that really has died out. And I think that it's one of those things we feel we have to hang on to. I think it's going to be fascinating for me because I'll be able to compare, if you like, and put myself in his shoes and imagine what it was like to drive those cars very competitively and very seriously for a long period of time. And I mean, nowadays you'd call them crude, you know, and they were very difficult to drive. And so it's interesting to get a perspective on all the problems that racing drivers then had to face.
But motorbikes were Damon's first love, Barry Sheen his first hero. So for him, the highlight of the weekend may well be the races which see the two ride head-to-head.
Yeah, absolutely, completely. I mean, I was bike mad, and Barry was the big star of the time. When I was a teenager, he was he was the only British hope in Grand Prix racing. The bike I'll be riding is a Manx Norton, and I can remember painfully, you know, taking a long time to build a replica model of a Manx Norton when I was a teenager. So I've never ridden one before, and I've certainly never raced against Barry Sheen, so that should be fun.
More fun than Lord March has been having for the past few weeks. Ensuring everything is just right is a stressful business.
Must be a nightmare, boys. It's all going together all right, is it? So this all just arrives and you then got the problem of trying to put it all together. So you hope someone got the measurements right.
No, most of it's all right.
It's all right, it looks great. The stuff we're doing now, these buildings and getting this bit ready is in many ways the small sort of tail end of the whole project. But it's pretty stressful, you know, it's sort of, you know, 4 hours a night kind of, you know. Tony, hi, very good to see you.
I can't get over all this work that's going on.
I know, there's a lot happening, isn't there?
Isn't it? I mean, how on earth are you going to get finished in time?
I haven't any idea. 4 weeks ago or something, I'd say we're in a bit of... I'm sure it'll get done.
Got grandstands, the whole shooting match?
Yes, they've all still got to go up.
Yeah.
We keep being assured by the project team that it's all going to happen. So all I can do is hope for the best. Well, I believe it when I see it.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's so much involved with it, and I'm so keen to get it right. That there's no, you know, I'm not really standing back saying, well, that looks great. I just want it to be right on the day, and for the whole thing to go well, and for the racing to be good, and you know, for nobody to get hurt, and for it to be a fun weekend, hopefully with the sun shining.
Nothing would stop me from going to see Sterling Moss at the wheel again, Jack Brabham at the wheel again, Dan Gurney at the wheel again. I just wish we could see Jim Clark at the wheel again, but being able to see the people that we are going to be able to see at Goodwood will be absolute magic.
If you did witness that at whatever age you were when it was live, if you like, you really, really want to go. I mean, it was something very special, something very unique, and I don't think that has ever been recreated in Britain.
oh, it'll be an outstanding success. And it's been well planned, and it's not something that's just come at the very last moment. It's been in the calendar right from the very beginning, and I think there are enough people with Goodwood in their blood to make sure that it's a roaring success.
I feel that the only problem it's got to face is it could damage itself by being too popular. Because I think it could easily, if the weather's good, I think you could get an enormous amount of people there.
I'll be there with tears in my eyes and a handkerchief at the ready and all my friends, and we'll be looking forward to seeing the cars that thrilled us so much then.